Let me introduce them very briefly, if we could. Nearly all of them are in the needs no introduction category. But quickly, to my far right, Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, the Senior International Partner at WilmerHale and former U.S. Trade Representative, known to many of you as one of the fundamental architects of China's accession to the World Trade Organization. Next to her, Peter Costello, long-serving leader of the Liberal Party in Australia, a veteran politician in Australia, is now the chairman of the Future Fund in Australia and is the longest-serving treasurer in Australia's history. Next to him, Ken Kobayashi, who is the chairman of the Mitsubishi Corporation, one of Japan's leading and most respected companies, known for its global investments and its leadership within the Japanese business community. Mr. Kobayashi is also a member of the Keidanren, the Japanese Employers Federation, and a very influential voice in the Japanese business community. And finally, to my immediate right, Kamal Nath, the former Commerce Minister of India, one of India's most celebrated and best known politicians. He is, I learned from him this morning, actually India's longest serving member of parliament as well, and someone who has been a long and tireless advocate for India's greater integration into the global economy. So it's a distinguished group, really ideal for discussing the topic at hand, staying connected and staying interdependent. A lot of discussion about the politics, about the security issues in our earlier panel. Our task is to drill down and discuss the nuts and bolts, the economics, and some of the material issues about what this new world looks like. I work for Time Inc., which is a company, as many of you will know, was founded by a man named Henry Luce, who is famous, among other things, for coining the expression, the American century. This was a famous essay that he published in Life magazine in 1942, I think it was, and he was urging, it was really a kind of implicit criticism of Franklin Roosevelt, who was then president, and he was trying to get Roosevelt to stop being so isolationist, to think globally, and to assert what he believed to be America's kind of rightful role as the moral and political and strategic leader of a new world order. Now, Luce was the son of a missionary, and he brought that kind of evangelical zeal to his message about the American century. But he really believed that no other country other than the United States could play this role of leadership that we've been talking about in our discussions this morning. So the American century seems to, I don't know, if you take it from the last conversation, seems to have already come to an end, well short of the century mark. And I think maybe that's the question that I'll start by asking our panelists is the American century really over? Are we really living in a world where there is no global leadership anymore? And is that the permanent state of affairs in the foreseeable future? Charlene, let's start with you.
Thank you. I think we have to be careful making absolutist statements at a very volatile time, politically, economically, in terms of security and the like. So the U.S. for the last 70 years has supported an open global system. But that has always masked in the United States not insignificant antipathy toward trade relations, fear of reductions in living standards, wage compression, job loss, if the U.S. remained open. And that's been a steady state, this antipathy, since 1790, and it has never changed. What did change, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years, are several things. Number one, the global financial meltdown, right, which had untoward consequences in the United States economically, exacerbating already high income inequality and leaving the have-nots with truly nothing from which many families will never recover. You have an extraordinary rate of change technologically. That is the primary culprit in the United States and globally for job loss, not trade, not globalization, but technology. U.S. manufacturing in aggregate is up by 2/3. Employment is down by 1/3. You have the advent of non-state actors, increasingly powerful, increasingly volatile, creating great uncertainty and anxiety, and a variety of other factors and features. And then in the United States, a presidential candidate, Donald Trump, with an unerring instinct for the capillary, reducing large concepts to very narrow concepts, deciding that in this system of globalization from which the U.S. has been the primary beneficiary, we've been cheated, we've been had, we've been duped, and hammering, absolutely hammering that notion, which took hold on already dry tinder from this general concern about trade and trade agreements in the United States. Most global leaders in the United States, most presidents in modern times, do the same thing. The populist push in U.S. presidential elections is nothing new. The difference is when you're elected president, most leaders pivot to governing from campaign rhetoric. Trump doubled down and then reduced it further as an instinct for the capillary to the notion that the real cheating has been our massive trade deficits. Trade deficits don't have anything to do with unfair trade. They're correlated to growth. They are not correlated to job loss. Nonetheless, everything he's done since, berating our allies because of trade deficits, berating NAFTA, berating the Korea trade agreement, berating TPP, berating the WTO because of trade deficits. Wrong diagnosis and therefore wrong policy prescription.
It's really interesting to me, your comments about the sort of change, though, in the tinder, you know, or the grass, you know, and that he's the spark. We have had, over the course of U.S. history, many populist sort of barnstormers in the mode of Donald Trump. You know, whether it's Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, you can go back to Williams Jennings Bryant if you'd like, but they've always fallen short of, in most cases anyway, of really getting the amount of power that Trump now holds. Is there something fundamentally underlying in the nature of the populists and the public attitude, though, about economics and trade and the system that we heard some of this comment in the earlier panel? And you know, you have an opportunist in Trump, but he's somehow now able to succeed in a way that earlier opportunists have not been able to. And there seems to be this implicit idea that, well, that's because the U.S. is not as strong as it used to be, that after the war, you know, the days of Henry Luce, the U.S. could shoulder all burdens, but now there's no longer that strength, that luxury to take all these free riders along with them. Let me ask Peter, what's it like in Australia? Is there a similar sentiment of suspicion and hostility towards the global order in the constituencies that you see in Australia?
Well, let me just say, in answer to your first question, I mean, is the US still a global leader? I would say yes, because it has more capacity in international organisations than any other country. But it is certainly not the unrivalled global leader. Yeah. There are now rivals, and people would say, is that good or is that bad? From my point of view, it just is.
Yeah.
It's happened, and it's happening. And I would say to you that this means that the global architecture does have to be redesigned. I think I spent a lot of time in the IMF, which does not represent the global economy as it exists now. It represents the post-war economy. China has to be given its rightful place in the IMF. It has to be given its rightful place in the World Bank. And if not, it's perfectly entitled, as it did with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to look for new arrangements. Perfectly entitled. and we better get used to it. And those of us that deal in the region are coming to grips with this in an economic sense. The more interesting question, which I won't go into now, is what does this mean in the defence and security sense? And that's where it could be far more disruptive in this region. Let me come back to the question you asked, though, about the rise of populism. The first point I'd make is I think it's all too easy to write this off as populism. Mm-hmm. People do have genuine complaints. I heard in the previous session someone said we'll have to retrain workers that have been put out of work, and we just moved on as if you just retrain them. I mean, I've been involved in these retraining programs. What are you retraining them for? Mm-hmm. They know when they go into these retraining programs, by the way, that when they come out there's no job for them. They're not going to become tech entrepreneurs at the end of a retraining program. They've never met anybody who's walked off the car assembly line and suddenly gone to Harvard or to Yale. They know that when these jobs finish, that's it for most of the people who've worked in them for a long time. It's much more complex than that, and it deserves a lot more than lip service. So the first thing I'd say is we have to recognise there is a legitimate complaint. Secondly, I'd say our politicians have overpromised and underdelivered. They have overpromised the benefits of trade and underdelivered the benefits, and the public is protesting in the only way they know, which is in an electoral sense. And the third thing I'd say is we have to get this debate right out of the clouds and down to the street level. I was an elected politician for 20 years. I used to meet these people. I used to ask them to vote for me. I don't think anybody ever voted for me on the basis of free trade. Yeah. They voted for me in spite of my support for free trade, not because of it. And you've got to develop a much broader agenda that free trade will lead into the following: rising incomes, jobs, maybe not for you, but for your children, opportunities for the society and for a country. And I think we've got to get far more sophisticated. And the worst thing I think you could do in a situation like this is just to say, you're all ignorant, you don't know what you're talking about, we'll wipe you off. There's one fundamental rule in a democracy: the voters are always right because ultimately they're going to decide it.
They have the power. Yeah, that's right. Let me turn to Ken Kobayashi next and ask for a business perspective on this. Japan, like Australia, one of America's closest allies, has often benefited from the free trade order that used to be the great goal that America championed. Suddenly that order has been upended with the new president. Is that disconcerting for Japan? How does that affect the strategies of Japanese companies?
Well, I think I'm only one from economic world among us. So, like Ambassador Wachewski said, that let me start with some historic movement. Well, as in Japan, as you all know, that Japan was we had nothing, natural resources. So what we had was the education and good labor force. Then traditionally, the pattern of trade was so-called improvement trade. That is, import the raw materials and the manufacture, then export for the overseas. But these 3 decades, it changes the business model. That is, we are investing overseas to create job and the manufacturing, then make a supply chain there, then supply and export. Whereas that of course affect that sort of business model being affected by the new movement. But actually in Japan, the 97% in numbers, the companies are all SME, that is small and medium-sized enterprises. I think the labor force-wise about the 55-60%. Then, well, we are now in that kind of pyramid. Then those SMEs, 97%, are more or less the subsidiaries of the large company in Japan. So if we have to cope with the recent movement, especially for the protectionism, then of course we need to shift our labor force and shift supply chain. That will affect to the Japanese SMEs quite a lot. And what I'm worrying about is that might change the culture. I think it's a good culture for Japan, that change the culture between large company and its subsidiaries, combinations or team. So that is one point. And the second point is, the anti-globalism or protectionism. The economies now tend to connect with the national security, and especially for the political world. Then political world connect to the populism. So we cannot think about only an economic world. We have to cope with the politicians, cope with the international organizations and people. That's why I'm here.
Kamal Nath, let me turn to you and ask for an Indian perspective on this. India is at an interesting moment right now because it's really starting to come into its own in terms of growth. China's growing a little slower, India's growing a little faster. There seems to be a lot of confidence and optimism. Do you think that India is out of sync with the rest of the world in the sense that it is becoming actually more open to global investment and trade at a time when many of the more advanced economies seem to be retreating?
Well, India is not out of sync because we got to look at all countries as country-specific. India has got specifics, and the most important of those specifics are its demographics. We have the largest aspirational society on this planet. And we have to, now that, you couldn't call that being out of sync. In a way, it is out of sync with the aging population in Japan and in many parts of Europe. So India has to look at it in a very India-specific manner. The sensitivities of India, the aggressiveness of India in global trade is there. India has matured. India has matured, rightly so, since the time the WTO started, even before that. And this process of maturity puts India in a position that it can drive many of the global trade agendas. The world has changed. We are not living in the world of 10 years ago. It's not only from the last 4 years, Charlene, or the last 10 months. So the world has changed. The question is, are we going to try and change the world, or are we going to try and change ourselves? I think it's easier to change ourselves. And that's what India is doing. India, after the WTO, has conformed. We've had, I remember the WTO negotiations, and I was a villain then. Many thought I was the villain there, not letting it happen. Essentially, being very India-specific, it was agriculture. Right. Subsistence farming. Right. Farming in India is very different to farming in the United States. You have farmers in the United States who are from Wall Street, but you have farmers in India who are subsistence farmers. For them, it's livelihood security. And 65% of the population, of the huge population of India, is agriculturally dependent. It's a huge sensitivity, difficult to perceive, for the world to even perceive. So, with all these complexities which India has, I don't think any country has such complexities. We have a fairly good manufacturing base. We have a good services base. India's services, that's why we are aggressive on services. And being aggressive in services is, again, maybe very India-specific. Our large population, our intellectual abilities, our IT skills, and so on and so forth. So I would say that India is not out of sync. We've got to look at every country as being country-specific.
Country-specific, Alfred's stuff. I see Charlene sort of nodding a little bit on these agricultural arguments that I'm sure are very familiar to her.
He browbeat me with them. So I'm nodding.
Well, I never had a chance to negotiate with her. Maybe we would have succeeded.
I just want to remind everyone about the Pigeonhole app. Feel free to start submitting questions. We're going to go maybe one more round here and then open it up to your questions. And also remind you that we do have microphones. So when we get going here, feel free to grab a mic and let us see who you are as well. That's also a great way to express your question. Charlene, I want to ask you about China because you were, as I mentioned, the architect of this deal to bring China into the World Trading Organization. We're now, 18 years on from that moment. And I'm sure that everyone here would love to hear your thoughts about how it has turned out in your view. Is it what you envisioned it would be? Was it what sort of Bill Clinton thought that it would be at the time? The argument that the administration made in those days, I remember, I was covering it for the Washington Post, was that bringing China into the global economy was going to be a net win for everybody, that there would be some jobs lost, but that overall we would all gain. It was the argument that, America can't be rich if China is poor. Let's grow together. The mantra on the Chinese side, win-win. And the idea was that we were going to make China a more liberal, kind of more like us kind of place, get it to play by rules. Has what transpired since then turned out the way you hoped and expected?
Look, it's a complicated question. I think that you were looking at China at the time, Zhu Rongji, one of the great reformers in Chinese history. You were looking at, obviously, a nuclear power, the world's largest standing army, a force for 5,000 years, obviously, and an economy that was in need of such extraordinary revision across every sector. And you finally had an administration in China that said, yes, we'll move forward, took the risk, which is a considerable risk. My own view is that, yes, this worked as intended in the sense that China's economy reformed to extraordinary degree, particularly in that first 8 or 10 years. It opened as a worldwide market for the first time. It was a bulwark of stability during the Asian financial crisis first, and then during the U.S. financial meltdown. It has been a generator of extraordinary wealth, and of course, lifting its population out of poverty in the process in a way unprecedented in history. All of these things are positive. Where the challenge has come in is that this reformist ethos, the ethos of rationalizing the state sector, trimming the statist economy, increasing entrepreneurship, moving toward global international norms of commercial conduct, faltered beginning in roughly 2007, 2008. Hu Jintao was a conservative leader, that's China's lost decade, as we all know, and stopped under Xi Jinping. So that momentum stopped, and of course the backsliding began. Reinvigoration of the state sector, reinvigoration of an economy far more dominated by policy aims and political aims rather than more open market ethos, and a disadvantaging to foreign entities operating in China, acutely the case in the tech sector, which has become extremely serious. That's created a skewed outcome, a set of skewed outcomes. One of the responses to it was TPP, a systematic approach to altering the rules and to taking old rules written and covering a new economy, which bears no relation to 1999 when we did the deal. And instead of taking that as a systemic approach to moving China back toward reform on globally acceptable means, the administration pulled out, leaving a vacuum, and China's more mercantilist approach largely unchanged, undisciplined. And that's extremely dangerous, I think, for the global economy as a general matter. So do I think it was the right thing to do to bring China into the WTO? Yes, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind, given the good things that have emanated from it. Do I think it was a mistake for the United States not to understand that one needs systemic changes and needs that systemic series of changes to better understand the global economy enshrined in newer and much more sophisticated rules and flexibilities? That's the mistake.
So this is interesting. Are you saying that when China started to shift into this more mercantilist stance with the rise of Xi and that the U.S. should have spotted that and there should have been some more proactive policy from the Obama administration to deal with that, to sort of set it on a proper course? The
U.S. should have done any one of a number of things. One, obviously, have found a better formula in the WTO.
Yeah.
The best rules, I think, are on a global basis, least fragmented, most growth generating, as opposed to the balkanization of trade, which tends to be more trade diverting than trade creating, point one. Point two, should have really taken TPP, moved it much faster, not been as fussy, right? That was a classic case of the perfect being the enemy of the good. Taken the European agreements the U.S. was working on, acronym TTIP, moved that along, combined TPP and TTIP. China, by the way, should have been in the room as an observer the entire time. That never happened because it would have started to shift when it saw the way its major trading partners were shifting. And you would have had, in effect, a new global round, but would have been pre-cooked to take into account a reality in which we're living in today that we had never been living in before.
Is it ironic to you that I remember in '99 when the deal was done, you were portrayed as the great trade hawk. Everyone said, oh, Charlene Barshevsky, she's so tough, she's too tough. Now the criticism is that the WTO deal wasn't tough enough. That we, where do you fit now on the spectrum of trade hawkishness relative to, say, Steve Bannon and Bob Lighthizer? Are they doing the right thing and being tough with China on trade?
I'm a trade hawk, meaning I'm an absolute internationalist, absolute globalizationist, but I don't like to lose. Yeah. That's how I'm a hawk. And that's how I negotiated. I think the view now, in terms of not being tough enough, or having not been tough enough, number one, doesn't recognize what the agreement was, which redid the economy of China. Number two, doesn't recognize all of the protections built into the agreement, including the ability unilaterally by the U.S. To block Chinese imports if they surge too much, a mechanism almost never used in the 13 years it was in existence. And more than that, doesn't really take responsibility for the United States not fixing its own economy, not watching out for its own competitiveness, and not addressing the complaints of those who felt left behind, complaints that have been there for 50 years, but never having implemented the kinds of programs to lift the entire population of the country of the United States, not just the West Coast and not just the East Coast of the United States. That's, I think, where the mistakes were.
Peter, yeah.
Can I just say, obviously the entry of China into the WTO was a step forward, and congratulations to all of those who are part of it. But I think one of the reasons for the rise of nationalism in recent years is the perception that the international organisations have failed. I mean, the WTO failed on the Doha round. In my view, the IMF failed on the financial crisis of 2008. Many people would think the UN is failing in relation to North Korea. I think one of the reasons why we're getting this surge in nationalism is that the institutions of the international framework have been tested and have been found out. And I think our populations are losing a lot of faith in them. Now, the response to that in the trade sense, because of the failure of the WTO, was for regional agreements. Well, first of all, for bilateral agreements, and then for regional agreements. Our country, Australia, was part of TPP. We didn't need TPP because we had a free trade agreement with China, with Korea, with Japan, with the US, but it was a quality agreement, and it would have anchored the region. Now, for domestic reasons, the US is not going to go ahead with TPP. It would be our very dear wish, and there are positive signs from the other 11, that TPP can still go ahead. It won't be the agreement that it would have been with the US in it. But enormous amounts of time and capital and energy have been spent on that. And the idea always was that it would be an open framework, that once these countries had done it, we'd try and bring more in. So there was a meeting in Sydney in August. There's going to be another officials meeting in September. There's going to be a meeting of ministers at APEC in Vietnam in November. Oh. And provided we can stop various countries trying to unravel, because once one country unravels, the whole thing will... we would very much like to see the TPP to go ahead. Now, the US wants to come into it in 4 years' time or whatever. Great. Very, very welcome. But why would we waste all of that effort? The second point I'd make very, very briefly is there is a big opportunity for China here. You saw Xi Jinping take it at Davos to portray itself as the leader of free trade. RCEP is an agreement that the Chinese could very much push. Countries like ours would be part of that. Our attitude is we would love regional free trade agreements. We'd love to do them with the US. TPP was a great agreement. If we can't, we'll do them with whoever. Yeah.
And
that should be the attitude of the region.
Do you think that TPP is viable without US leadership?
Well, I think we are now in a very crucial moment.
Yeah.
Definitely, we need the international framework for the free trade before the protectionism taking root, or the protectionism as the taking place with the free trade. And actually, the world production increases 2.3% in the last year, whereas the world trade can only increase 1.3%. We call it a slow trade.
Right.
So we have to stop it by means of of course, bilateral agreement. But in addition, we need to quickly conclude the TPP as it is. That means that I'm the strong supporter of the TPP 11, and actually, together with our government, we are finishing more or less with the EU. We are finishing the EPA with EU quite soon. Then our first priority is a TPP 11, as is. And this TPP 11 must be high quality and comprehensive so that it could be a benchmark for the regions. We have a good supporter like Singapore for the TPP-11 movement, and hopefully we will conclude the in principle within this year. That's quite important because the TPP-11 could become the so-called benchmark for the regional trade agreement, including RCEP.
So, Kamal Nath, you're a hardened trade negotiator. You're a realist. You know how these things work. A lot of optimistic talk here about RCEP, about TPP, TPP-11. Are any of these things, from your vantage, are they viable? Do they offer much promise for India?
Well, I've been a great protagonist for regional agreements.
Yeah.
And at one time, I was criticized for it, saying that it undermines the WTO.
Yeah.
And I said that regional agreements are building blocks, to the WTO, because all regional agreements are WTO plus.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the point of the United States, where United States not only drove global trade, but more important than tariffs and all that has been the rules of trade. The rules of trade.
Right.
And what is just not free trade. It's free trade with rules. And the United States defined what trade, global trade was. But global trade was just not the movement of goods. It meant also intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
It brought in a patent regime. You know, it insisted that there's got to be a patent regime. So it was the rules and those which were not really relating to tariffs. Sometimes we get confused. We use this word FTA. There's nothing like a free trade agreement. What do you mean by FTA? I used to always say, what is an FTA? So when we were doing our agreements, like we did with Singapore, we called it the Economic Cooperation Agreement, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, because there was no, it was being called the FTA in the beginning. When we started with the FTA. And an FTA is, I think, a complete misnomer, because there is nothing known as free trade. Oh. It's trade with rules, it's trade which includes services, it includes disciplines. So I would think that regional agreements are very important. When the WTO was on the front burner, now it's on the back burner, even more so now. If you look at the RECP, the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership, which is being negotiated with ASEAN and the ASEAN Plus 6, I think it's not a bilateral agreement. It's a multilateral agreement. It involves 3 billion people. It involves 40% or more of global GDP. And how do you call that bilateral when it involves 3 billion people? So I think the time has come for regional agreements. And whichever country wants to be on board, if the United States doesn't want to be on board, and they will come on board, I think, at some point when they realize that they've been left out, because the United States can't be isolated in any sense of global trade. So they will come on board. But I think, in conclusion, the regional economic cooperation agreements are really very important at this point of time.
We have some questions coming in. I want to get to them, but I want to ask one last one of Charlene Barshevsky here, and that is, we are living in this moment when the Trump administration still seems to be evaluating what its trade policy with China is going to be. He came in talking tough on China. There was the meeting in Mar-a-Lago. They struck up this kind of strange romance. There's been the suggestion that the U.S. will go easy on China if China cooperates a little bit on North Korea, and yet at the same time we're starting Section 301 proceedings against China. I mean, very difficult to kind of figure out. It must be, if you're sitting in Zhongnanhai, to sort of say what is actually the consistent trade policy here. But if this doesn't work out, if Trump doesn't get the cooperation that he wants, if he feels compelled to kind of continue to pander to his base, and we get some tough trade sanctions against China, give us your read as an expert as to how China will react and what will be the sort of ping pong back and forth between the two countries?
I guess I'd make two comments. First of all, I don't think the administration has any policy with respect to China.
Doesn't have any policy?
I don't think so. I think that's reasonably clear.
Yeah.
I think Jim Mattis may on the defense side, for example.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the trade and economic side, the only policy articulated thus far is some combination of get tough or threaten but trade for something else or something on that order. And I don't think there's an appreciation for what China's geostrategic aims are. I don't think there's an appreciation for the way in which China uses economics and trade in order to further those aims. And then I think in turn there's no appreciation for the way in which that intersects with China's conception of its military resources in defense of this very robust sort of Eurasian heartland strategy. So that's point one. Point two, I think that there are those in the administration that seem to have the view that the United States can act unilaterally and it won't be a problem other than net gain for the United States. So this is preposterous. It's a nonsense. The United States will act to the extent it acts unilaterally. China, Europe, Canada, Mexico, they've all been very upfront. They will retaliate. That will put tremendous pressure politically on the administration to retreat. And of course, you don't ever threaten what you won't do. And when you do it, you have to know you're going to be successful doing it, or really you're in a bigger ditch than when you began. So I don't think that even on the narrowest policy sense, I don't think there's been thought given to exactly where this extremely aggressive articulation of policy would go if implemented. There's a theory that this is how Donald Trump always negotiates. He puts something outrageous on the table and uses it on the theory that it will so scare the opponent will give him what he wants. But we've already talked about the shifts occurring in the world. We've talked about this emerging multipolarity, the notion that the United States is no longer viewed on the ascendancy. If that's the case, then the entire assumption that is being used as the basis on which this policy will be created is false. Absolutely
this is
false.
Extraordinary. I mean, you're one of the sharpest, shrewdest negotiators in the world by sort of general acclaim. And if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying that Trump has no negotiating strategy
Correct.
at all and has not really considered how this could spin out of control with America's most important trade partner.
He has a personality, and he has what he perceives to be a winning business formula. Okay? That doesn't get you anywhere actually where you need to go when it comes to international relations or trade relations, or when it comes to U.S. global positioning.
Let me take some of the questions that have come in. There's one from Harjit Bhatia that is actually a good one. Given all the headwinds that we've discussed that have been unleashed by the prominent global leaders against trade, what are some recommendations for staying interconnected and independent? What can we do? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the bilateral agreements, the regional agreements, but is there something else that, I mean, Kobayashi-san, is there something that corporations can do?
Well, I think quite simply, we have to join in that the framework and the international agreement together with the government. In case of Japan, the politicians and the private companies, executives, the way of thinking are a little bit different. But these days, it's coming to the in the same world, so that for instance, for the states well, it's the Trump administration is now for the America first, but we are experiencing by means of the grassroots approach together with the government that there are still many supporters of the free trade among the state governors, politicians, and officials, and business people. So what we have to do in case of Japan is to approach those, and repeatedly the expressing the value of the international the multilateral frameworks. That is one thing. The secondary, as for China, it's quite difficult issue because we are quite near in the neighborhood, and we have lots of investment there. But apparently, the Xi Jinping is not an economist. So, we have to be a little bit careful. But of course, it depends upon the type of the industries. But for instance, car industry, we have already committed a lot. But the others, sometimes we wait for the new development. And this case, we have to carefully choose the partner. Unfortunately, these days, the comparatively better partner as the national company. But, we have to, in case of China, we have to carefully find a partner in there.
Kamal Nath, there's a question here for you about what it's from Preeti Daura, who asks, is the downward spiral of the Indian GDP a sign of where the economy is headed? What's the key cause for that? What steps should India take to restore its growth to 7 to 8%? Would you agree with that India is in a downward spiral? It doesn't look like a downward spiral to me.
Well, there were certain events over the last 1 year which led to this downwards. I wouldn't say it's a spiral. It went down.
Yeah.
There's no spiral at all.
Slightly slower growth.
So India has had sustained good GDP growth over the last 15 years. It's not something which is happening now in the last 2 or 3 years. It's been there.
Yeah.
And so there's no spiral. There were the effects of India had a demonetization, which is now being criticized. It was criticized then by me and our party, but demonetization didn't bring about it. It dislocated the economy. All the economists world over said that this is going to dislocate the economy. It did dislocate the economy, and that's one of the reasons for this downfall. But there's again another reason that our manufacturing sector, the way it should have moved up, has not.
Well, so tell us a little bit about that, because you're in the opposition now, but Modi won, triumphed over the Congress Party in part with his promise that he would be better in managing the economy, that he was the reform candidate, and that he understood manufacturing. You've got this big publicity for the Make in India campaign. He gets a hero's welcome every time he goes to speak in the United States or other cities. How would you evaluate his track record on economic reform?
Well, he has great communication skills, undoubtedly, and he not only communicates with people in India, he communicates with people all over the world.
Okay.
And but then all this has a lifespan, because people are going to say, what then? What's in it for us?
Yeah.
Whether it's any of these slogans, Skill India or Digital India or Make in India, whatever it is. At the end of the day, what does it get to my pocket? And that's the questions when, as elections approach, people will start asking. So India's reforms is nothing, most of the reforms have already taken place when my party was in government. I don't want to sound partisan, but when we were in government, that's the time the maximum reforms took place. And in fact, the maximum reforms took place when I was the minister.
When you were
so now trumpeting reforms, I think what India needs is reforms in governance. That is the biggest reform India needs. Mm-hmm. It's not reforms in policy. Today I think we are more liberal in investment than the United States is. there are many sectors in the United States you can't invest. But in India, we are absolutely open. So reforms in India has taken place. And this, again, catchword, reforms. India is reforming. I think we got to reform just not policy, but reform governance. That's the biggest thing which has to happen. On the point of communication, the corporate sector needs to be sensitizing and driving governments towards trade. And unless policymakers, politicians engaged with this are engaging also with the corporate sector, it's not going to happen. Because if the corporate sector says all this trade is rubbish, India is a huge market. When we had the crisis in 2008, we thought that what's going to happen to India? But India had such a big domestic market. Even if exports, say in the textile sector, were going to go down to the United States or to Europe, we had the Indian market to take it over, which did happen. Yeah. So the next point is that communication with the people, with political parties. India is not only the largest democracy, we are also the rowdiest democracy. And you have to be communicating. We got the leftists, and who always challenge anything about free trade, challenge WTO, which they continue to do till today. But unless you're communicating with them. So communication politically, communication with the corporate sector is very important if we really want sustained growth in global trade.
But are you partly suggesting here that this is an opportunity for the Congress Party to kind of outflank Modi and the BJP by campaigning on a reform platform? I mean, sorry for sounding skeptical, but it's very hard for me to imagine the Congress Party being, I mean, I can imagine you articulating a free trade platform, but the rest of your colleagues in the Congress Party trying to outmaneuver Modi by saying, actually, we're more pro-economic reform than he is.
It's not we saying it or they saying it. Yeah. The facts speak for themselves. The facts are speaking for themselves. When did the reform start? It started with the Congress Party. When did they take place the most? When were the most major reforms? You can do a tidbit reform and say that you've done so many reforms, but these tidbit reforms are not going to get you anywhere. So I think the track record says it all. So it's not whether the Congress Party is saying it, it's whichever government did these reforms. We started the reforms in 1991, and it was started when our then finance minister and the who went on to become the prime minister, he continued doing what he had started.
Peter, there's a good Australia question here, which could equally apply to Japan, but the question, just to summarize a couple of them, is Australia an Asian economy or a Western economy? Does it have to choose between aligning itself with China and the United States on trade and other issues, or can it continue to be equal friends with both powers?
I don't think Australia has to choose in a trade sense at all. Our biggest trading partner is China.
It's China now.
And it's been an incredibly successful relationship. We have a good relationship with the United States. We have a free trade agreement with the United States, which has been very successful. I don't think that will be a difficulty for any of the countries in this region trading with China. And I can say in my lifetime, the rise of China has been indisputably a good thing for my country and for its economy. The difficulties will come, I think, when the economic rise of China leads to security issues. South China Sea, Nine-Dash Line, those sorts of issues will create difficulties for some of the countries in the region that are more pro-Western, Singapore, Philippines. These are issues where security and economics may intercept. And that's why it's very much in the region's interests and all of us to see the peaceful rise of China and an integration into a security arrangement which will preserve the peace and the trading opportunities within the region. Now, even China, when you deal with China, you tend to deal with the economic wing or the military wing, and you get two different views. If I may say so, you get the same in the US. You get a very different view from the Pentagon as you'll get from the US Treasury. China seems to coordinate itself a bit better, and it does sometimes use economic levers for security and defence advancement. This is not unusual in the world. It's not the only country that does it. But you've got to be very clear in your objectives, and I've noticed this in my dealings, to make sure that you're not getting compromised one area for an advancement in another area. And provided you can do that and deal on as much as possible an equal basis, I think you can reconcile both regional security and enormous trade benefits from the development of China.
Thank you. We are right on our time limit. I'm going to let that be the last word. I can hear some rumbling stomachs out there in the audience, and it is lunchtime. So with that, please join me in welcoming our excellent panel and sharing their ideas with us. Thank you all very much.